Hello there. Welcome back to the First Stage Woodworking Podcast. My name is Paul Hyatt and I'll be your host. We talk about craftsmanship and finding meaning in our lives. I hope that you enjoy this podcast and that you will like, subscribe, and share it along with other people who might be interested in stuff like this. Thank you and God bless. Hello and welcome back to the First Stage Woodworking Podcast. Just as an announcement, if this is the first time that you've been listening to this podcast, please listen to the other episodes. It really helps me out. But in particular, I would really be thrilled if you would take a look at the recent podcast that I did with my friend Josh Johnson. I think that conversation that we had was incredibly valuable and good for a lot of people to hear. Not to cherry pick one particular group, but I think that it's particularly useful for young men to listen to that particular episode. So if you are a young man and if you are kind of lost and need some direction, then I highly recommend you take a listen to that podcast. But any of my podcasts, I think, kind of seek to try to be able to do that. Today, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite topics to talk about that I've been talking about a lot recently because I've been in a book club about this particular topic. But it's about my love of all things J.R.R. Tolkien. And in fact, the namesake of this podcast was actually inspired by a time frame in my favorite book called The Silmarillion. Which was, it's actually, as far as I understand it, it was the book that Tolkien began working on when he was in World War I. In many ways, it's kind of like the book that The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, some of the favorites of people, it kind of was the brainchild of all of that work. But he, kind of worked on it for almost his whole life, but never finished it. It would be published, edited and published by his son Christopher Tolkien, I believe in the 1970s. So, I have been in a book club recently where I've been fortunate to be, working with some incredibly brilliant people on the Lord of the Rings and reading through each of the chapters, and there were just some really cool tidbits that kind of came out of all of that, and I decided that today I would just do a reflection on one of my favorite characters out of the book. Might be, King Aragorn is probably my favorite character of Lord of the Rings. Is kind of the whole story of him. But Faramir is also one of my favorites. And in particular, I want to talk about him because he is the character that I believe the movies got wrong. Now, don't take that as a slam to the original trilogy of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. Those are fantastic films, and if you haven't seen them, then you should watch them. But read the books. Like read the books first, and then you'll see what I'm talking about here. But definitely read the books, and hopefully, if you have not read the books, that maybe this episode will inspire you to read The Lord of the Rings, because it is a fantastic book. Now, why would I say that that this story, because that's what it's a fantasy story, really. Why would I put such a high importance in my life? I think that I've read Lord of the Rings now 4 or 5 times, the Silmarillion certainly that many times. Why would I keep coming back to this book? Why is it so important? And well, it's because, number one, I just love stories, and I think that we all do, and I think that our world is in peril if we kind of lose sight of the story. It's one of those things that I teach about this in my Western political philosophy course, that like when a point really needs to be made, like one of the greatest, um, uh, it's one of the most life changing allegories. It's a type of a story that's ever given. It's kind of like seen as somewhat of a supreme truth when looking at Western philosophy, particularly with regard to politics, is Plato's allegory of the cave. So I mean, Plato was an incredibly rational person. Uh, when he really needs to make a point, he doesn't, give us a bunch of stunning statistics and random facts that he's strung together. No. He tells us a story, and I think that there's a great amount of value to that. And when we look at when we look at our world today, I mean, like the what built the Western world essentially was the story of Christianity, the story of Jesus Christ, and and I I think that our world could learn a lot from that. That perhaps we should get closer and closer to the stories, and maybe further and further away from some other things that we are pursuing in our modern world these days. But stories essentially are very important, and that's what Tolkien gives us, is a very important story, because he gives us uh, another central aspect that makes a story great is having great characters. And what makes a character great, I think, is that when you can relate to that particular character, and that's the thing that I think that you find in the character Faramir, that if you are striving to be a good man, if you are striving after the good, then you would look an awful lot like this character by the name of Faramir, which is why I want to talk about him today, because the movies get him quite wrong. Though the movies are very good, they just, at least in the version of the movies that made it onto the screen, they don't really do a very good job with the character Faramir, though they do get some things right about him in the extended edition. But the books, Faramir is a person that that we should all aspire to be like. So I want to talk about how Faramir is. He's the vision of the good, of the good man, aspiring to be good and oriented properly in all things in his life. So let's talk about him, and essentially talk about the embodiment of the positive masculine figure, I guess, is what we're going to be talking about in this particular podcast. Which again, this podcast is about talking about meaning, and I don't think that I think that it's self-evidently the case that that if you are a young man or even an old man or a middle-aged man like me, you should be aspiring to be a good man and to be oriented toward being positively masculine. Now, I guess before I'll begin there too, I'll talk just a second here about what I mean by positively masculine. To take kind of a more Aristotelian approach with regard to the virtue of being masculine, is that it's got to be somewhere between the extremes of what we see taking place in our world today. So don't peg me as like an Andrew Tate type. That's not what I'm getting at. I would say that's on the polar end of one extreme. But a man should also not. So basically, Andrew Tate is nothing new. We've seen his ilk before, and in fact, Western philosophy has actually always been against people like Andrew Tate. Because he's a sophist. He essentially, his philosophy is that might makes right, and that the world is yours for the taking, and that you should go out and take it for all that it's worth. And it's a very egocentric view of the world, which again does not reflect what Western thinking has been after for quite some time, which is what we refer to as Republican virtue, or in other words, doing good for the good of all. Um, so you live a moral life in order to more fully take part in society. So if you embody the good, then you will be more fulfilled, more happy, more full of joy. There will be more evangelium in the world, essentially. Um, but the polar side of that would be a weak coward. So both of these, I think, are the archetypes of, and you see them all over the place in the world today. But I think that we should attempt to embody more so a character like Faramir, the positive masculine. So, what are the traits essentially? What is it that makes Faramir such a great character to model one's life after? Well, I've been alluding to it. It's that idea that he's oriented properly, um, uh, and he is able to look at the world around him, and instead of choosing to go after um, glory, fame, after achieving victory. It's not what you get from him. He is essentially humble. He is going after wisdom, and he acknowledges his own limitations, and he also acknowledges that there is such a thing as authority, so therefore there must be such a thing as legitimate authority, and he's able to recognize it immediately. Um, and Tolkien does this brilliantly by giving us various different visions of men, basically. So Faramir represents a very, very positive male figure. His brother, but Faramir is going to be contrasted with various other characters, and Faramir is also not the only positive male character that you get in these books. Also, because you also get King Aragorn, obviously, Frodo, the Ring Bearer, and Sam, and also Merry and Pippin, and many other really, really good characters. But again, I want to talk about Faramir because he's not treated fairly, I think, in the movies. So the characters that he contrasts with that I'm going to talk about also are Boromir and Denethor, which Denethor is Faramir's father, Boromir is his brother, and then another character by the name of Grima Wormtongue are basically the characters that he contrasts with, I think, to the best in the books that I'll be painting as I go through this little discussion here. So, when it comes to these characters, what we kind of get is this Aristotelian idea of what it is to be virtuous. And what I mean by that is that Aristotle made the claim that we can understand virtue as a mean between two extremes. Okay, so, or in other words, the reason why courage is a virtue is because it rests perfectly in between cowardice on the one hand and foolhardiness on the other. Okay, so we'll take the foolhardiness aspect first. Okay, Faramir is not foolhardy. He is courageous and wise. Okay, so he knows his own limitations, and because of that, he knows that he must be properly oriented. But his brother Boromir is foolhardy, and Faramir is going to acknowledge this in the Two Towers. This scene is that Faramir, through his wisdom, has figured out. He's kind of drawn out of Frodo and Sam that they have the One Ring, So Faramir has an opportunity here, an opportunity that's very similar to what his brother had. He could take the ring, but the ring is many things. But I think that the thinker Joseph Pearce is very, very correct when he says this, that the ring, above all things, or I think can best be understood um, as sin itself. That's why Frodo has to bear it. So basically, Frodo is an image of Christ suffering toward Calvary. So he takes upon all sin unto himself. And Faramir knows that he cannot wield it. So he cannot wield the ring. And he tells us this in various different ways. He says that if he were to find, he wouldn't pick up the ring if it were laying by the side of the road. Basically, he says things like he wouldn't lie to ensnare an orc. Now, I mean, whether he's boasting or not, we it's hard to tell, because he doesn't want to be exposed to the ring. So like he's trying to dedicate himself to being saint-like, and which is kind of what we are called to do, is to be a saint. And a wise person, a wise saint, knows that they cannot bend sin, they cannot use sin in order to be able to bring about a positive end. And that therefore it's unwise and it's unsightly to engage in sin, because it leads to death. And that's what we see take place with regard to Boromir, is that Boromir believes that he can take the ring, defeat the dark powers of the world with it, save his kingdom, and be this great hero and have this great amount of glory. But the attempt to take on that sin leads to his death, which that's what sin does. I mean, like that's why you shouldn't engage in sin, is because by engaging in sin, it leads us to death. That's why especially mortal sins are referred to as mortal sin, because they lead to death across the board, the spirit or the soul and the body. So a wise man, Faramir, being a wise man, realizes that, which I mean, again, a very, very wonderful analogy there. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. So it's this fear of screwing up, basically, that drives Faramir to not take the ring for himself, and to recognize, to be properly oriented as a servant or a steward of the good, to not take the ring and to allow the hobbits to go and do as they will. And that clearly shows a very, very proper orientation. And especially when we look at, I mean, like if you're a young person, you listening to this, and you've gotten it into your head that it's okay sometimes to lie, I'm just telling you it's not. All lies, all falsehood, any sin that you engage, it will be discovered down the road sometime. So perhaps it'll help you in the short term, but in the long run, if you're living out a lie, it is going to eventually be discovered, and it is going to more than likely be very, very devastating. So we get from Faramir's that he is, just in this one little depiction here, he is wise, he is and humble, and he is oriented toward the good. So like those are three things that are very, very good, I would say. And I would also say that the movies get that whole scene completely wrong. They kind of, they kind of have this like good cop, bad cop routine going on, and Faramir is not even portrayed as the good cop. So it's really not very well done. They kind of show that it was this great embattled struggle that he had. When in the books, that didn't really happen. So again, read the books, and then you can watch the movies and perhaps develop an idea of that yourself. The next thing, though, is to talk about cowardice and why it is unvirtuous to be coward-like. And this is a relatively um, short one to take a look at here. But Faramir is going to go out in a great battle at the orders of his father to defend the city of Gondor, which I would say that's a scene in the extended editions of the movies that they actually get right. So we're in the book The Return of the King now, or in the movie The Return of the King. And they do actually give us one good scene of what it is to really be Faramir. Gandalf looks at Faramir as he's riding on a horse out of the city. Faramir is riding on a horse out of the city. And Gandalf looks at him and he says, essentially, like, look, you don't have to throw your life away unwisely here. Like, you don't have to do this, though it's the bidding of your father, because it's basically a suicide mission. And Faramir looks at him and he says something to the tune of, basically, I come from this great line, this great tradition of being a man of Gondor and being of the line of stewards. And basically, I love this city, and I would, I think that he says, I would gladly lay down my life for her beauty, which is a beautiful scene that shows, again, the proper orientation of one's life. That it's one of those things that he's not aspiring for death in battle in order to be able to attain glory. He's number one, duty bound. He does what he is told by the authorities that be, because he recognizes legitimate authority, even when it is not being wielded too terribly well. But there's another wonderful scene about that I'll get to a little bit later. That also didn't make it into the movies. That is beyond me why it didn't. But in any case, but he recognizes that he comes from a great tradition. Okay, and that's, I think, that another thing that we really need to recognize in our world today. That wisdom kind of dictates that if you want to gain some wisdom, you're not going to figure it all out on your own. So what do you have to rely on? Tradition. You go back and you look at the past and you see what mistakes have been made, what great things you can learn from the past and bring them into your life. And then you breathe new life into those ideas. And but they're different because they're a part of you now, and you've embodied them, and you embody them differently than anyone else because you're you and they were all those people. So, and there's a profound beauty to that is awe-inspiring, and I think that is something that that young men should really aspire to in their own lives. Is that it's like you have to be dedicated to something, so it might as well be truth, beauty, and goodness, which is essentially what Faramir tells us in that scene, and what is reflected in the book, and that it takes courage to be able to do that, but that it's a noble pursuit, and that your life will be fulfilled while pursuing those things. So essentially, don't seek the minute-to-minute pleasures of the world. Seek the good, and things will. Your life will be a much more fulfilled one. But his father, though, Denethor, the steward, is not courageous. He has been looking into the Palantir, which Joseph Pierce talks about this, that basically, Tolkien, we think, might have been using the idea of the Palantir as an analogy for the emergence of television. Um, that by staring into, basically, if you haven't read the books, which for like the 50th time, read the books, and read them before you watch the movies. But the Palantir is uh, this orb that uh, gives farsight to the king, or in this case, the steward. So they were the property of the rightful king of Gondor. But some of the stones have gone missing, and some of them have fallen into the hands of the enemy. So Denethor doesn't realize that he is staring into this thing that is creating more and more despair and darkness in his life, to the point where he, it is drawn to do some things that are of the heathen kings of old, I believe it says in the books, which is, I think, incredibly well put based off of where we are today in our world. So, my question for the audience, and my question, to young men, is that it's like, what are you staring into that is maybe leading to your life being more dark, less courageous, less properly oriented, leading you toward despair? And I think that we all know the answer to that, especially in a world where we not only have television, but you can basically walk around with a television in your pocket all day that you can see whatever you want to. And I think with the massive increases that we've seen in suicide and things along those lines, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that perhaps Tolkien was right in all of this. So Denethor despairs, and he in he does this thing that he misconstrues as an act of bravery, and that's what Tolkien does in this, and it's brilliant. Is Denethor in his despair? He says that we're not going to be able to defeat um, the dark powers that be. So he despairs, and he seeks to take his own life. And the scene there in the book points out Denethor's pride in doing this, which is kind of the root of all evil. The root of all sin is one based off the idea that you have it all figured out, and though this path before you is going to lead to some struggle and hardship, defending this city might not go so well. But we know self-evidently that despairing and taking one's life in that particular instance, or really any instance for that matter, is not a good idea. And so you have these two different things here. That it's like you have Faramir, who is courageous, that he goes out in defense of the city. And Denethor, the rightful steward, has the potential to do that, but chooses not to. So again, when we look at these characters of Boromir, who is foolhardy, Faramir, Denethor, who is a coward, we see that contrast between those characters, and I think that it's even more brilliant that the Tolkien put them all in the same family. So you see an image of the good emerge out of, in many ways, kind of the most unlikely of places. So definitely beautiful imagery from him on that particular aspect of Faramir. Now, as for the sense of duty, and doing one's duty and recognizing legitimate authority and seeking to serve that and being a steward. Again, these are all things that make for a great person. A great man is one that is not a life marked by what you gained while you were alive, but more so whom you served. And how many people you served and how well you served them. And our world today. I think that this podcast might be turning into me just being a social critic, which, I mean, so be it. Um, but instead of serving oneself, it's like, how can we serve others and serve um, a legitimate good? And I think that there is, that I just simply have to read it. It's one of my favorite points in the book. It might be my favorite moment in all of the books. So this scene takes place in the Return of the King, the Houses of Healing. Uh, Faramir was essentially fatally wounded, and Aragorn, the rightful king of Gondor, who is essentially Tolkien's idea on the embodiment of Christ the King, um, which I think it's very, very interesting that there's this old prophecy that this old woman talks about. She says that the hands of the king will be the hands of a healer, which is beautiful imagery, which, again, if you didn't know this, J.R.R. Tolkien was a devout Catholic, so like all of this nonsense that you'll see where he was not drawing at all from any religious tradition, that's not true. He did say that Lord of the Rings is at its core a theological and Catholic work. So you're going to see that clear representation in various different characters. So Aragorn is Christ the King, and he hasn't actually proclaimed himself as king yet. So he's going to enter into the city of Gondor to go to the Houses of Healing to heal his friends and others that are in need of his healing. So we kind of see Christ, the miracle worker, also in Aragorn here, and Faramir is at death's doorstep, and Aragorn comes in and heals him. And that whole scene is just so incredibly powerful that I just simply have to read it to you. Um, Suddenly Faramir stirred, and he opened his eyes, and he looked on Aragorn, who bent over him, and a light of knowledge and love was kindled in his eyes, and he spoke softly, "My lord, you called me. I come. What does the king command?" Ugh. Like, you know what I mean? Just like he immediately recognizes the true, the beautiful, and the good, the embodiment of Christ the King. He's the good steward. He was the servant that was waiting at the gate. And now he's like, he's like almost dying. He's like pierced by an arrow. It's like he should be dead, but he immediately wants to get up and do God's will. And it's like, that's like, that's like a spirit-filled life. It's just incredible stuff. But he continues on, or this is Aragorn now. "Walk no more in the shadows, but awake," said Aragorn. "You are weary. Rest a while, and take food, and be ready when I return." "I will, Lord," said Faramir, "for who would lie idle when the king has returned?" Ugh. just a perfect scene that shows his stewardship and his duty and his proper orientation toward legitimate authority. Um, Aragorn doesn't kick in the doors and say, "I'm king," and he begins making people do a bunch of things that they otherwise would not do, or not act according to their own reason and things along those lines. It's like, well, no, because that wouldn't be legitimate authority. That would be power, as defined by Niccolo Machiavelli. So we see Faramir immediately recognize that it's like, here he is. Here's the king. And I must dedicate my life to serving him. It's like, thank God for that. It's such a powerful, powerful scene. Now, the last point that I would like to make, that and I listened to Bishop Robert Barron recently talk about this, and I loved it. It was wonderful. It was one of his recent homilies. This is May of 2023, but he was talking about the marks of the Holy Spirit on a person's life, and he saved the best for last, which I think is the most true, and I think that there's also a reason why J.R.R. Tolkien leaves this last image of the goodness of Faramir for the end of the book, which is this image of Faramir's love. and what it means to be filled with love and to be loving. But essentially, the greatest mark of the Spirit, um, you know, I think that pretty much all Christian denominations would agree that above all things, Christ is love, and showed His love for the world and poured His love out onto us and continues through His grace, and thank God for that. Um, but a mark of the Spirit on an individual is not what you did, not your accomplishments, not um, the things that you gained in this life, um, but it's did you love? Did you love to the fullest? Did you put your own selfish desires by the wayside? Um, uh, in order to be able to be a good servant to those who are around you. And I think that that's one of the things that we're missing in our world today is that we're getting further and further away from the great virtue that made the world a great place to be, which was loving one's neighbor. I think that we need to bring that back into our society. It's like I think that everyone kind of feels that the Western world is on life support at this point. I think the thing that will jolt us back um, into reality again, into living our lives for the fullest, is to be more loving. Now, when I say love, I don't mean uh, a lot of the more modern connotations with regard to love. I mean the traditional idea of love, or in other words, the correct idea of love, which is to will for the good of the other. Um, you see, if I am a teacher and I have my students come in, like a great teacher, again, is marked, I think, by the love that they have for their students. Um, so when we say that we love our students as being great teachers, or if I love my craft as being a great craftsman, or whatever it may be, it isn't that I tell these kids what they want to hear. It isn't that I um, accept them for as they are right now and just say, well, everything's okay because you're perfect. No. I look at them and I say, like, no, you can always improve. You can always be better. Whatever you are today, you can aspire to be something greater tomorrow, because God wills for us to be great. We're called every day to greatness. Uh, so so like that aspect, and that's greatly enriched my life, and it has greatly enlivened my teaching and makes it to where when I go to teach, I'm essentially pouring myself out to these kids because I greatly care about their development, because I love them. And it's much the same way when I'm working in my shop. I pour myself into my craft in order to try to make something as beautiful as I possibly can because I love it. Um, so it's like, in what ways can you become a more loving person? Well, I mean, we can look at the love that Faramir shows to Eowyn. And it's an incredible one to look at. But we do need to take a step back, though, because I need to talk about this other character that I alluded to at the beginning of all of this, by the name of Grima Wormtongue. See, Eowyn, this beautiful young woman that is incredibly talented, uh, that is kind of like she's got this unfortunate aspect of her uncle, who is her father figure in her life, because her father died, I believe, when she was very young. Has essentially become an invalid because he has been deceived and essentially had his mind destroyed by the powers of Sauron and Grima Wormtongue, uh, and Grima, who is I mean, essentially what you have taking place there with King Theoden, uh, who's the king of Rohan, who has been deceived and made into an invalid, basically. Um, he is uh, uh, so he's trying to essentially politically destroy the kingdom of Rohan so that it can be taken over by the forces of darkness in Isengard, and under Sauron. So that's obviously not good. Um, and but you also have you have this this kind of idea that he's whether passively or not involved in a political conspiracy of sorts. So there's that lust uh, for power, essentially. But then you also, and I think that Tolkien does this purposely. He also lusts after this woman that he knows that he cannot have, um, but he is doing everything that he can to take that which he cannot have. So Grima Wormtongue is essentially what Saint Augustine talks about as being libido dominandi, or driven by lust, driven by our desires. And lust, I think, can be essentially understood as when we're talking about human beings, when you remove the humanity from them and make them into an object of your lust. So you are willing to do anything in order to be able to gratify your impulsive desires at anyone's expense. So Grima Wormtongue is very clearly a wicked person. And again, he is committing these terrible mortal sins, and it leads to his death later in the book. Um, and I do think that is a character they got really, really well in the movies. But you have Eowyn, who she was pursued by this wicked, evil loser, basically. This backward, very, very dark, evil, broken person, because he's essentially claimed his sin. He isn't just making a mistake. He is complicit in this conspiracy to undo the good in the world. So he can kind of be understood as a Judas figure, a betrayer, but also a betrayer who lusts after this woman. Which, if there's of course betrayal in that as well. So not a good guy, Grima Wormtongue. So he's an image of the fallen man, and especially when trying to take instead of trying to kind of win the love of Eowyn by his own merits, he seeks to manipulate her and to bend her to his will, essentially. So if you're a young woman listening to all of this, I'm going to be talking here about what are the marks of a good man that you can pursue, and what are the marks of a good man, to help you not wind up with an evil, wicked person. So I just mentioned one of them that. And it's kind of the whole point of what I want to talk about here is that Grima Wormtongue, when we talk about a person manipulating others, typically that means that they use really, really high language that is maybe hard for people to understand, but it all sounds really, really good. And I think that you see a lot of that going on these days. But I think that, again, the mark of a good person is, can you understand them? Do they speak plainly, or are they clearly trying to manipulate and mislead you? And that's kind of what we can do with our speech. So again, Grima Wormtongue seeks to manipulate, whereas with Faramir, you're going to see him with his speech seek for the good of others, or to illuminate other people. So yeah, we have Eowyn, who is broken. She's lost her father figure. She's been pursued by this terrible person, and Faramir sees her and immediately takes an interest in her. And it's such a powerful scene that you see take place here between the two of them, because Eowyn looks at him eventually while they're walking through the courtyard of the Houses of Healing and kind of going through their healing process together, which Faramir has been able to fully heal, again, because he recognizes that legitimate authority. Eowyn isn't quite oriented just right yet, um, but Faramir is going to bring her to that because of his love and his plain spokenness. Um, so uh, so Eowyn looks at him and she basically tells him to just just like give it to me plainly, speak plainly. What are you like? What is it in these dark days that you are? What's keeping you going, basically? And he looks right at her and he just says that he's like, there's all of this beauty in the world, but I've never seen anything quite as beautiful as you. It's like, I mean, and like what, I mean, like, what young woman, I think, I mean, I'm not a young woman, but, I do really, really like it when my wife calls me handsome. So, I mean, like, it's like, what young woman doesn't want to have a man look at them and say, like, you are beautiful and I would spend the rest of my life in service to and to be a good steward of your beauty and to protect and defend that against all wicked men who might try to destroy that. Even though when you look at Aowen, she's very, very capable. I mean, she just destroyed one of the Dark Lords, one of the Nazgul, the king of the Nazgul, actually, the Witch King. So it's like she very clearly can handle herself, but but again, there's that dedication there on Faramir's part, and it's convincing. It's self evident in the way that he carries himself. There's that confidence there. There's that stoicism there, that he just is like he sees what is before him that is of great value to him, and he names it accordingly. And you again see this character Eowyn become healed because of it. Then a little bit later, after they have found out that the ring is destroyed and that the whole world isn't going to go up into a ball of flame, you have Faramir. Again, Eowyn is like, speak plainly to me. What is it that you want to say? And he, tells her that he's like, I love you. And that is what a man does, folks. Little boys, emotionally immature people that never want to grow up, seek to manipulate, to pull a beautiful person, a good person, pull them further and further away from those who would lead to them being happy and whole and healthy, in order to be able to take them for themselves, essentially. And that's not what Faramir's doing here. He looks at her and he says, like, I love you, I want to marry you, and I want to go and spend the rest of my life tending a garden with you, a garden with you in Fair Athelion, where she would essentially be the stewardess of the people of Gondor. Which is, I mean, like what a beautiful image that that Tolkien gives us, that when we have a husband and a wife properly oriented toward their marriage, then what you have is a return to the garden, where sure, there may be some serpents in the garden that may try to undo your marriage, but if you have made the proper sacrifices, if you are willing to do everything that you can for the good of the marriage, then it will survive. And that is, I think, a very, very hopeful message that we can all benefit from, and hopefully that's very, very self-evident to you. But essentially, that last mark of what makes Faramir a great character and a great person that we ought to aspire to be like in our lives, is that he is a life marked by love. So Remember these things that we talked about. Going after wisdom and understanding, and realizing that the source of that is the fear of God. To recognize and want to serve legitimate authority and others. To be duty bound, to be courageous, and to love to the fullest. And if we can do all these things, then surely, I say unto you, we will inherit the kingdom of heaven. So thank you all for listening, and I will see you all next time. Thank you for tuning into this podcast. I hope that you'll like, subscribe, and share this information along with people who may be interested in it. God bless.